So let's talk about seizing the midboard and starting off the game on the right foot on the path to victory, with an overview of some of the secrets and uses of scout rules in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking core gameplay tactics, and in this one I thought we'd do a focus review of the Scout special rule, all the options it can add to an army, as a powerful tool to get some first turn advantages, board control and plenty more. It's one of the rules in Warhammer 40k that's really not too hard to use intuitively, but does have a bunch of subtleties and really quite a lot of different ways to use it, with pre-game moves to gain board control and threaten the enemy, so I thought we'd go through a big roundup of them now. For the actual rule itself, the Scout special rule essentially allows you to move X inches at the start of the first battle round, just after you know who's taking first turn. In things like the Pariah Nexus and the chapter approved 2025 mission deck, you resolve any pre-battle abilities first, and then these trigger at the start of the first battle round, so technically before any player's turn has begun, so before you've generated command points or drawn secondary missions or things like that. The Scouts rules basically give you a pre-game move of up to X inches, where say for example you might have the aptly named Astra Militarum Scout Sentinel. They can scout 9 inches, so you can make a normal move of 9 inches anywhere from their position. For the order of who gets to move scout moves, it's the player with the first turn that gets to move all their scout units first, so that could be an advantage in seizing board control if both players are trying to move into the same area, though also it does mean that the player going second can kind of react to them a bit. They get to see where those moves have happened before they get to counter move. The rule does have a few subtleties. You have to have the Scout special rule for the whole unit, including any attached characters. So say for example, if you had a scout moving unit like a Cursed Cultist, and you joined a character choice to it like the Dark Commune that didn't have the Scouts keyword, the entire thing wouldn't be able to scout. For certain units and certain character attachments, that can be really quite a big deal. For transport, if it's a dedicated transport, then you can make a scout move with it if all the things inside have the scout keyword. That only works for dedicated transports though, so not things like Land Raiders for example. When you're making the scout move, you have to remain at least 9 inches away from enemy models, so they can be used to deny you areas on the board, both enemy scouts and infiltrators potentially doing that. So there isn't any restriction on going close to the enemy deployment zone, unlike infiltrators or I think certain previous rule sets in 40k. And they also added a bit in the balanced data slate where if a unit's got say the scout's 9 inches special rule but can only move 6 inches via a normal move, they did state that you can move up to the scout distance specified. That could be relevant for say Zogrod Wartsnagger joining some Gretchen. Between all that though, in a nutshell, the scout special rule allows you to see who's got first turn, and then move certain units in your army with the special rule around, potentially either setting them up to gain board control, stay safe, or play aggressively before the game's even begun, so get a small but very useful positioning advantage depending on exactly what they're trying to do. For the benefits of the Scout rule, probably to break it down into categories, the biggest advantages are gaining an advantage depending on who has first turn, pushing units up to gain board control, to disrupt or destroy the enemy or score objectives, or potentially playing very aggressively, launching units towards the enemy deployment zone to either tie them up, annoy them, or wipe out certain units turn 1. Starting with the first one way to view the Scouts rule is a sort of nudge that you can do to try and gain an advantage in literally the first turn of the game. On a pure damage dealing point of view, it can allow you to play aggressive versus defensive. Say if you've got a scout squad that's set up in the midfield, which also has the infiltrate keyword, you basically get to find out whether or not you've got first turn, and then the scout squad's going to have some choices before the opponent even gets to act. If you've got the first turn, you know that you get to move, act, deal damage and stuff before the enemy is going to have any chance to destroy that unit. So if it made sense to, you could have the squad maybe boldly move out towards some enemy infiltrators nearby, and perhaps your first turn plan be to move towards them, shoot them and charge them, knowing full well that you're going to be guaranteed to get the jump on a lighter enemy infantry unit right from the go turn and start the game off on a good footing. Otherwise, if the opponent got first turn, ideally you might have deployed them where they can scout move towards safety, perhaps dropping the squad back behind a ruin, and that means that when they do get first and advance their troops and fire off a bunch of guns and things, they're not going to be able to target that unit and you don't just lose them. And if they want to take them out, then they might have to do something like charge a melee unit at them and then hopefully expose that unit so the rest of your army can line up and delete them in short order. There's plenty of far more serious threats that can do scout moves as well, and it could allow you to have units playing aggressive versus defensively. For example, Leagues of Votan Sagittars get scout moves, and they've got at least some fairly serious firepower with that high last beam cannon. If you're in a deployment where the opponent's exposed a couple of units, perhaps they're playing knights and they weren't able to hide them all, your Leagues of Votan Sagittars could react depending on whether they got the first turn. If you get first turn, they could potentially move out to gain lines of sight, and hit the enemy hard with those beam cannons and take down some targets on the Alpha Strike. If the Knights get turn 1, then ideally they can all scurry for cover nearby, hopefully being deployed where the 6 inches of movement that they get will be enough to break lines of sight. So perhaps in an ideal world, if the Knights player gets first turn, they've got nothing to shoot, and if the Leagues of Votann player gets first turn, they've got plenty of shooting that they can do. Obviously in reality it might well not work out quite that perfectly, but certainly might be an easy way to get a leg up right at the start of the game. Beyond first turn damage advantages, perhaps the more major benefit of Scouts for a lot of units is more towards the sort of board control, staging, and pushing your units up the board to achieve dominance over the centre. Say for example, if you had a unit of World Eaters 8-bound, they can use their scout move to get into a very threatening position turn 1. Even if the opponent's deployed so far back they've got nothing to charge turn 1, they could still set up to try and take a mid-board ruin, maybe deploying completely exposed in the deployment zone, but knowing that their 6-inch scout move is enough to get them towards a midfield ruin, and from there the opponent won't be able to get any lines of sight on them turn 1, and then they'll be in a very dangerous position as to whether or not the opponent wants to approach that ruin, knowing that there's a big scary melee unit there. And if they go close enough, it's going to come bursting out and tear down one of their units. It's also pretty great to do that with cheap annoyance screening units as well as big fighting melee ones. Maybe say doing similar with a unit of Necron Tomb Blades. Perhaps a small cheap squad of 3 of them moves into a midboard ruin, again out of line of sight so the opponent isn't going to be able to shoot and kill them turn 1. Then turn 2, if the enemy's got some important reserves to come in, they could be really useful in keeping those reserves backing away from the bulk of the army. The Necrons behind them spreading out so there's no easy deployment zones in the backfield, and then they could be towards the front lines using their forward position and good movement to extend the place where they can't drop a huge amount further, potentially meaning that they need to drop somewhere towards their own deployment zone just to get on the board. Nuisance units could also strike out from here to tie up enemy units with annoyance charges, maybe bully lighter units, and do trading things on objectives or block movement lanes. If you happen to be able to make a scout move and get units into a safe-ish place on a primary objective, that can also be pretty nice as well. Maybe a good example of that could be Kaschan Jungle Fighters for the Imperial Guard, cheap scout moving infantry, each with OC2. So if they're getting onto a primary objective, you are probably going to have to destroy the squad if you want to take that objective or deny it to the guard. If they didn't have a scout move, they might need a turn or so to get towards a mid-board objective, but with a 6-inch scout and then their 6-inch normal move, plus maybe advance and move, they should be reliably able to get a bunch of bodies onto a mid-board point turn 1, or ready to score it on turn 2. If they were able to remain in a mid-board ruin while doing so, if the opponent wants to try and take them down, they might need to charge them, and hopefully be a good trade in exposing that unit to the rest of your army to destroy it in turn. As well as deep strike screening and scoring primaries, moving things up to the mid-board early on can help with a whole bunch of secondaries as well. Maybe Infiltrators might do that a little bit better with more flexibility, though more expendable scouting units in the right positions can be handy enough. Say if you draw cards like Engage on all fronts where you need to get into an enemy table quarter, needing cleanse for extra expendable units on the mid-board objectives, or all manner of other things that you need to be in the centre of the board or further forward for. Cheap units of scouts could be in a really good position to do that. Then there's maybe the potential to either disrupt or do charges in the first turn of the game for certain fast-moving scout squads, potentially changing the entire course of the game either by move blocking a big significant chunk of the enemy army, or even destroying things turn 1 if you've got some scary melee scouts. This one's one of the reasons that Zodgrod plus Gretchen were quite so oppressive in the Mordaka formation. When they could war turn 1 just for one command point, it means that you could have an enormous expendable unit of Gretchen surge all the way forward towards the enemy army and just wall in a huge section of it with their massive footprint. They might even do some damage along the way, but even that's just a really good way to start the game off on a great footing, with plenty of enemy armies just literally unable to move past them and pin back into their deployment zone for the orcs to do orc things and score some stuff and advance up the boards to get in melee threat range. Any scouts unit that can move fairly far and ideally have a good unit footprint could threaten to do that though. Maybe Cerberus Raiders or Space Marine Scouts that could infiltrate between wherever they're set up. A scout move, a normal move, plus maybe an advance, you could afford to get them right in the face of the enemy. And you've got the potential to cover really quite a lot of board space with even something like a 5-model squad, maximally strung out to 2-inch coherency range. The opponent won't be able to move within 1 inch of you during the movement phase, so for any ground-bound things without the fly keyword, it could mean that they'll either have to stay more or less where they are in their own deployment zone, or try and move around you, which is probably going to make them move forward way slower. If it makes more sense as well, and depending on the army, you might be able to do nuisance charges to disrupt the enemy. Say having tanks without good melee profiles locked in combat might again stop them moving if they want to do any shooting this turn, and perhaps stop them from gaining some nice lines of sight and things. Plenty of scout units can do big scary first turn charges for damage though. Maybe some good examples might be World Eaters 8-bound. They could scout forward 6 inches, move 10 inches, and then charge an average of 7. So just on average that gets them into an engagement range of a unit 24 inches away. Never mind if they've got any other movement buffs or they swing high a bit. Some deployment maps have you at least 24 inches away from the enemy, but there's plenty of ones that have bits of the deployment zone well within that, so definitely potential to get first turn charges there. Maybe other good examples might be Ravenwing Black Knights with their scout enhancement in the company of hunters, or the Emperor's Children Lord Exultant plus Infractors, maybe jumping out of a transport, or if those are big serious units that can both move forward, certainly threaten turn 1 charges against the right enemy deployed in the right place, and deal a lot of damage when they get there. Obviously the benefits of that are pretty obvious if you have the right target. If the opponents put a super valuable damage dealer or some other critical thing at the front of the army, and just first turn you can just send up a unit to move up and tear it to shreds, then that's going to be a big start to the game. And on top of that, you might be able to do some other disruption things as a secondary goal, maybe destroying the thing and then consolidating into something else to tie it up, or perhaps even scoring certain early game secondaries along the way. I would bear in mind though that there's a good chance that you're throwing whatever unit that you do this with immediately to its death. And even if it does mean that you can get some good damage in against a target, unless you're literally doing more damage than the unit had to offer, or getting more utility than that, you might not necessarily trade off very well. Sure, the opponent still has to deal with a unit that charged up, but most units that both scout and have good damage don't tend to have very good defense for their cost, and those units will now be right at the forefront of the enemy army, so the opponent can just line up all their heaviest firepower and just flat out delete that unit, often with minimal effort. And it might mean that some of their scary melee threats now actually have a unit that they can charge and kill turn 1 when otherwise they wouldn't have, or lots of gun things might have an easy line of sight to something that otherwise they wouldn't have been able to shoot. It's definitely still a pretty great idea in the right situation, and could definitely massively disrupt the enemy moving towards the mid-board to score objectives as you go, but to bear in mind from a raw damage and defense type thing, unless they can literally kill something that's of greater value in the enemy army than your scout unit, getting that unit killed super easily has the potential that it might not actually get you that far ahead in the game, if at all. For actually putting scout units down on the board, or cheap nuisance scout units at least, there's a good chance they could be a pretty reasonable choice to drop earlier in the deployment phase as opposed to later on. As by putting down scout move units, you're not really giving up quite so much information as to where they might be. You're putting down a squad that could be, say, 6 inches in either direction, so the opponent's got only a vague idea of where they might be, and they do get to see the entire enemy army before they essentially redeploy themselves at close range. So small expendable scout units moving forward for ball control style things might be pretty reasonable ones to put down early in the hopes that the opponent has to display where they're putting some of their bigger threats to help you make decisions with where you're going to counter them. That might not be the case quite so much though if your scouts are more valuable damage dealers, as in that case it might be preferable to wait until we've seen the enemies put their units. If you've got something that could do first turn charges or big first turn damage dealing, then ideally you might want to see where the opponent's units are to make sure that scout moves can get them where they need to be to deal that damage, and that's be more weighing up against the other enemy units as normal. It could be pretty helpful to see where enemy infiltrators have been as well, as they could limit your options as we'll get onto. Before that though, I thought it was worth mentioning dedicated transports. I feel like for the most part scouting them up the board just pretty much helps out with what they want to do anyway. It protects the unit inside, and then they can be a useful staging post for jumping out of, maybe moving and disembarking to get units in range of shooting, or helping out melee units by a 3-inch disembark out the front of the transport before that unit gets to move. So even if the transport wants to go elsewhere, it has 3-inch to the threat range of that unit. For scouting dedicated transports in particular, some sort of content switching shenanigans could be handy, and potentially get units that can't scout up the board a lot faster. In theory, you could have a transport with a scout unit inside it, use the scouts to move the transport up turn 1, immediately get the scouts out at the start of your turn 1, and then have the transport parked in such a way that a unit from your deployment zone can then move up and embark in it, and then the transport can move off and zoom them up a long way up the board, maybe ideally into ruins in the centre, so the transport's nice and safe and a staging point for the next turn. You could do that with something like some Space Marine incursors in an impulsor and have a fighty squad like Blade Guard jump into it perhaps. Might not always be worth the setup, but could be one way to gain a bit of extra movement for a scary unit. Finally though, as mentioned, definitely worth talking about scout moves and infiltrators. If you've got important scout move units in your army that aren't just screening chaff type ones, then a unit or two of infiltrators can really help out. The biggest counter to shutting down enemy scout moves will be to put a strong out squad of infiltrators somewhere in the mid-board. The scouts unit won't be able to move anywhere within 9 inches of them with that pre-game move, and that means that if you deploy the infiltrators as close as possible to the enemy deployment zone, the scouts unit might not be able to move out of it. It could be a really big deal for things like, say, those World Eaters 8-bound. A big strong out unit of infiltrators might be able to prevent them from getting anywhere near the enemy lines in a first turn charge type thing. It's one of the things that gives a huge draw to have at least one unit of infiltrators in a list, as if you put them down at the start of deployment, you basically have claimed that section of the board, and enemy scouts and infiltrators won't be able to deploy in it, and it can give you a bunch of breathing space behind it for the rest of your army, knowing they're not going to get absolutely rushed or blocked into their deployment zone turn 1 quite so easily. Encountering those enemy options as well, it also helps out your own scout units behind the unit. So say for example the Leagues of Votann player, they've got 2 Sagitaurs and some Hernkin Pioneers, all of which would really quite like to scout and get into some ruins in the midboard or take up some early lines of sight. So they've chosen to put their unit of Hernkin Jaegers in the midboard, and that means that the Space Marine player wasn't able to deploy their Infiltrator unit there, as potentially if they'd deployed all of their scout units first, and then they hadn't put the Jaegers down yet, then the Infiltrator squad could have maybe sacrificed itself to just prevent all those scout moves, and if the Space Marine player got first turn, perhaps even move up to box in the Sagittars and Pioneers so they couldn't even move past them with their regular movement. By putting the Jaegers down as the first drop though, they could safely deploy all their scout move units behind them, and knowing that they're going to actually be able to make use of that rule, potentially pushing up the board aggressively. And if that doesn't make sense, they've still got the option of playing a bit more conservatively, maybe loitering their own deployment zone and hiding behind terrain if the Space Marines do get first turn. Basically, for most factions in 40k, if there's a cheap and efficient Infiltrator unit that you've got access to, it generally tends to be well worth taking at least one copy of for these kind of reasons, and far more so for armies that really rely on their scout moves going off to gain a load of value for certain units. Leagues of Votann are definitely a great example, but maybe Emperor's Children with Infractors and Lord Exaltants, or World Eaters with their 8-bound could be a couple more good ones. In any case, let me know your thoughts on Scouts tactics in Warhammer 40k. Do you tend to include this unit class in your armies or not? And let me know what sort of units you take and why. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel, then I do have a Patreon page, that's linked down in the video description. A big thank you to anyone supporting there. Channel patrons do get a few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link's down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.